Chapter 47 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 47. A Queer Encounter in a Cave. The place into which I had crawled was of irregular outlines. Rocks jutted along the sides, and between these, small lateral shafts had been dug where the miners had followed the ramifications of the Kisa. The cave was not a deep one. The vein had not proved profitable, and had been abandoned for some other. I kept up it till I was fairly in the dark, and then groping against one side I found a recess, in which I ensconced myself. By peeping around the rock I could see out of the cave and some distance over the bottom of the barranca, where the bushes grew thin and straggling. I had hardly seated myself when my attention was called to a scene that was passing outside. Two men on their hands and knees were crawling through the cactus plants in front of the cave. Beyond them, half a dozen savages on horseback were beating the thicket, but had not yet seen the men. These I recognized easily. They were Gode and the doctor. The latter was nearer me, and as he scrambled on over the shingle, something started out of the rocks within reach of his hand. I noticed that it was a small animal of the armadillo kind. I saw him stretch forward, clutch it, and with a pleased look deposit it in a bag that was by his side. All this time the Indians were whooping and yelling behind him, and not 50 yards distant. Doubtless the animal was of some new species, but the zealous naturalist never gave it to the world. He had scarcely drawn forth his hand again when a cry from the savages announced that he and Gode were discovered, and the next moment both lay upon the ground pierced with lances, and to all appearance dead. Their pursuers now dismounted with the intention of scalping them. Poor Richter! His cap was pulled off, the bleeding trophy followed, and he lay with the red skull towards the cave, a hideous spectacle. Another Indian had alighted, and stood over the Canadian with his long knife in his hand. Although pitying my poor follower, and altogether in no humour for mirth, knowing what I did, I could not help watching the proceedings with some curiosity. The savage stood for a moment, admiring the beautiful curls that embellished the head of his victim. He was no doubt thinking what handsome fringes they would make for his leggings. He appeared to be in ecstasies of delight, and from the flourishes which he made with his knife I could see that it was his intention to skin the whole head. After cutting several capers around it, he stooped and grasped a fistful of curls, but before he had touched the scalp with his blade, the hair lifted off, displaying the white and marble-like skull. With a cry of terror, the savage dropped the wig, and running backward, fell over the body of the doctor. The cry attracted his comrades, and several of them, dismounting, approached the strange object with looks of astonishment. One, more courageous than the rest, picked up the wig, which they all proceeded to examine with curious minuteness. Then, one after another went up to the shining skull and passed his fingers over its smooth surface, all the while uttering exclamations of surprise. They tried on the wig, took it off, and put it on again, turning it various ways. At length, he who claimed it as his property pulled off his plumed headdress, and adjusting the wig upon his own head, front backward, stalked proudly around, with the long curls dangling over his face. It was altogether a curious scene, and under other circumstances might have amused me. There was something irresistibly comic in the puzzled looks of the actors, but I had been too deeply affected by the tragedy to laugh at the farce. There was too much of horror around me. Seguin perhaps dead, she gone forever, the slave of the brutal savage. My own peril too at the moment, for I knew not how soon I would be discovered and dragged forth. This affected me least of all. My life was now of little value to me, and so I regarded it. But there is an instinct, so called, of self-preservation, even when the will ceases to act. Hopes soon began to shape themselves in my mind, and along with these the wish to live. Thoughts came. I might organize a powerful band. I might yet rescue her. Yes, even though years might intervene, I would accomplish this. She would still be true. She would never forget. Poor Seguin! What a life of hope withered in an hour! He himself sealing the sacrifice with his blood. But I would not despair. even with his fate for a warning. I would take up the drama where he had ended. The curtain would rise upon new scenes, and I would not abandon the stage until I had accomplished a more joyous finale, or failing this, had reached the denouement of death or vengeance. Poor Seguin, no wonder he had been a scalp hunter. I could now understand how holy was his hate for the ruthless red man. I, too, had imbibed the passion. With such reflections passing hastily, for the scene I have described, and the sequent thoughts did not occupy much time, I turned my eyes inwards, to examine whether I was sufficiently concealed in my niche. They might take it into their heads to search the shaft. As I endeavoured to penetrate the gloom that extended inwards, my gaze became riveted on an object that caused me to shrink back with a cold shudder. Notwithstanding the scenes I had just passed through, this was the cause of still another agony. In the thick of the darkness I could distinguish two small spots, round and shining. They did not scintillate, but rather glistened with a steady greenish lustre. I knew that they were eyes. I was in the cave with a panther, or with a still more terrible companion, the grizzly bear. My first impulse was to press back into the recess where I had hidden myself. This I did, until my back leaned against the rocks. I had no thoughts of attempting to escape out. That would have been from the frying pan into the fire, for the Indians were still in front of the cave. Moreover, any attempt to retreat would only draw on the animal, perhaps at that moment straining to spring. I cowered closely, groping along my belt for the handle of my knife. I clasped this at length, and drawing it forth, waited in a crouching attitude. During all this time my eyes had remained fixed on the lustrous orbs before me. I saw that they were fixed upon mine, and watched me without as much as winking. Mine seemed to be possessed of abstract volition. I could not take them off. They were held by some terrible fascination, and I felt, or fancied, that the moment this should be broken, the animal would spring upon me. I had heard of fierce brutes being conquered by the glance of the human eye, and I endeavoured to look back at my vis-a-vis with interest. We sat for some time, neither of us moving an inch. I could see nothing of the animal's body, nothing but the green gleaming circles that seemed set in a ground of ebony. As they had remained motionless so long, I conjectured that the owner of them was still lying in his lair, and would not make his attack until something disturbed him, perhaps until the Indians had gone away. The thought now occurred to me that I might better arm myself. I knew that a knife would be of little avail against a grizzly bear. My pistol was still in my belt, but it was empty. Would the animal permit me to load it? I resolved to make the attempt. Still leaving my eyes to fulfill their office, I felt for my flask and pistol, and finding both ready, I commenced loading. I proceeded with silence and caution, for I knew that these animals could see in the dark, and that in this respect my vis-a-vis had the advantage of me. I felt the powder in with my finger, and pushing the ball on top of it, rolled the cylinder to the right notch, and cocked. As the spring clicked, I saw the eyes start. It will be on me now. Quick as the thought, I placed my finger to the trigger, but before I could level, a voice with a well-known accent restrained me. "Hold on there!" cried the voice. "Why didn't ye say yer hide were white? I thought 'twere some sneakin' Injun. Who are ye, anyhow? 'Tain't Bill Garey? No, Billy, 'tain't you, old feller." "No," said I, recovering from my surprise, "it's not Bill." "I mout 'a guessed that. Bill would 'a knowed me sooner. He would 'a knowed the glint o' this nigger's eyes as I would his'n. Ah, poor Billy. I's afeard that trapper's rubbed out, and there ain't many more o' his sort in the mountains. No, there ain't." "Rot it," continued the voice, with a fierce emphasis. "This comes o' layin' one's rifle ahint him. If I'd 'a had targets wi' me, I wouldn't 'a been hidin' here like a scared possum. But she are gone. That leetle gun are gone. And the mar too. And here I am, without either beast or weepon. Cuss the luck." And the last words were uttered with an angry hiss that echoed through every part of the cave. "You're the young feller, the captain's friend, ain't ye?" inquired the speaker with a sudden change of tone. "Yes," I replied. "I didn't see ye were comin' in, or I mout 'a spoke sooner. I got a smart lick across the arm, and I were just a tyin' it up as ye tumbled in there. Who did ye think this child were?" "I did not think you were any one. I took you for a grizzly bear." "Ha ha ha! I thought so, when I heard the click of your pistol. If ever I sets my peepers on Bill Garey again, I'll make that nigger larf till his guts ache. Old Rube took for a grizzly. If that ain't... Ha ha ha! Ho ho!" And the old trapper chuckled at the conceit, as if he had just been witnessing some scene of amusement, and there was not an enemy within 100 miles of him. "Did you see anything of Seguin?" I asked, wishing to learn whether there was any probability that my friend still lived. "Did I? I did, and a sight that were. Did 'ee ever see a catamount riz?" "I believe I have," said I. "Wal, that were him. He were in the shanty when it felled. So were I myself, but I wa'n't there long arter. I creeped out sommers about the door, and just then I seed the cap, hand to hand with an Injun in a stand-up tussle, but it didn't last long. The cap gin him a sockdolager sommers about the ribs, and the nigger went under. He did." "But what of Seguin? Did you see him afterwards?" "Did I see him arterwards? No, I didn't." "I fear he is killed." "That ain't likely, young feller. He knows these diggin's better'n any o' us, and he oughter know whur to cache her, I reckon. He's did that, I'll be bound." "Ay, if he would," said I, thinking that Seguin might have followed the captives and thrown away his life recklessly. "Don't be skeered about him, young feller. The cap ain't a-going to put his fingers into a bee's nest where there's no honey. He ain't." "But where could he have gone, when you did not see him afterwards?" "Where could he ha' gone? 50 ways he could ha' gone through the brush. I didn't think o' lookin' arter him. He left the Injun where he had throwed him, without raisin' the har, so I stooped down to get it, and when I riz again, he wa'n't there nohow. But that Injun were. Lor, that Injun are some punkins, he are." "What Indian do you mean?" "Him as jined us on the Del Norte. The Coco." "El Sol! What of him? Is he killed?" "Wal, he ain't, I reckon. Nor can't a be. That's this child's opinion of it. He kim from under the ranch arter it tumbled, and his fine dress looked as spick as if it had been just tuck out o' a bandy box. There were 2 at him, and lor, how he fit them. I tackled on one o' them a hint, and gin him a settler in the hump ribs, but the way he finished the other were a caution to Crockett. 'Twere the puttiest lick I ever seed in these here mountains, and I've seed a good few, I reckon." "How was it? 'Ee know the Injun that are the Coco fit wi' a hatchet?" "Yes." "Wal, then, that sur's a disparate weepon, for them as knows how to use it. And he diz. That Injun diz. T'other had a hatchet too, but he didn't keep it long. 'Twere clinked out o' his hands in a minute, and then the Coco got a down blow at him. Wah! It were a down blow, and it wa'n't nothin' else. It split the nigger's head clear down to the thrapple. 'Twas separated into 2 halves, as if it had been clove with a broad axe. Ef he had a seed the varmint when he kim to the ground, he'd a thort he were double-headed. And just then I spied the Injuns a-comin' down both sides of the bluff, and havin' neither beast nor weepon, exceptin' a knife, this child took a notion wa'n't safe to be thur any longer, and cached, he did." End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 48. Smoked Out. Our conversation had been carried on in a low tone, for the Indians still remained in front of the cave. Many others had arrived, and were examining the skull of the Canadian with the same looks of curiosity and wonderment that had been exhibited by their comrades. Rube and I sat for some time in silence, watching them. The trapper had flitted near me so that he could see out and talk in whispers. I was still apprehensive that the savages might search the cave. "'Tain't likely," said my companion. "They mout if there hadn't a been so many of these diggins, d'ye see? There's a grist of them, more'n 100 on t'other side, and most of the men who got clur took furrer down. It's my notion that the Injuns seed that, and won't disturb, if there ain't that dog." I well understood the meaning of the emphasis with which these last words were repeated. My eyes, simultaneously with those of the speaker, had fallen upon the dog Alp. He was running about in front of the cave. I saw at a glance he was searching for me. The next moment he had struck the trail where I had crawled through the cacti, and came running down in the direction of the cave. On reaching the body of the Canadian, which lay directly in his track, he stopped for a moment and appeared to examine it. Then, uttering a short yelp, he passed on to that of the doctor, where he made a similar demonstration. He ran several times from one to the other, but at length left them, and with his nose once more to the ground, disappeared out of our view. His strange actions had attracted the attention of the savages, who, one and all, stood watching him. My companion and I were beginning to hope that he had lost me, when to our dismay he appeared a second time, coming down the trail as before. This time he leaped over the bodies, and the next moment sprang into the mouth of the cave. A yell from without told us that we were lost. We endeavored to drive the dog out again, and succeeded, Rube having wounded him with his knife. But the wound itself, and the behavior of the animal outside, convinced our enemies that someone was within the shaft. In a few seconds the entrance was darkened by a crowd of savages, shouting and yelling. "Now show your shootin', young feller," said my companion. "It's the new kind of pistol you've got. Load every barrel of it." "Shall I have time to load them?" "Plenty of time. They ain't a-going to come in 'ithout a light. Turn gone for a torch to the shanty. Quick, will yer? Slap in the farder." Without waiting to reply, I caught hold of my flask and loaded the remaining 5 chambers of the revolver. I had scarcely finished when one of the Indians appeared in front with a flaming brand, and was about stooping into the mouth of the cavern. "Now's your time!" cried Rube. "Fetch the nigger out of his boots! Fetch him!" I fired, and the savage, dropping the torch, fell dead upon the top of it. An angry yell from without followed the report, and the Indians disappeared from the front. Shortly after, an arm was seen reaching in, and the dead body was drawn back out of the entrance. "What will they do next, think you?" I inquired of my companion. "I can't tell exactly yit, but they're sick of that game, I reckon. Load that barrel again. I guess we'll get a lot of 'em before we gins in. Cuss the luck, that gun targets. If only I had that leetle piece here. Ye've got 6 shots, have ye? Good. Ye mout chock up the cave with their cartridges before they can reach us. It are a great weepon, and no mistakes. I seed the cap use it. Lor, how he made it tell on them niggers in the shanty. There ain't many of them about, I reckon. Load sure, young feller. There's plenty of time. They knows what you've got there." During all this dialogue, none of the Indians made their appearance, but we could hear them on both sides of the shaft without. We knew they were deliberating on what plan they would take to get at us. As Rube suggested, they seemed to be aware that the shot had come from a revolver. Doubtless some of the survivors of the late fight had informed them of the fearful havoc that had been made among them with our pistols, and they dreaded to face them. What other plan would they adopt? Starve us out? "They mout," said Rube, in answer to my question, "and kin if they try. There ain't a big show of vittlin' here, exceptin' we chaw donics. But there's another way, if they only hev the gumption to go about it, that'll get us sooner than starvin'. Ha!" ejaculated the speaker, with emphasis. "I thort so. They're a-gwine to smoke us. Look ye yonder." I looked forth. At a distance I saw several Indians coming in the direction of the cave, carrying large bundles of brushwood. Their intention was evident. "But can they do this?" I inquired, doubting the possibility of our enemies being able to effect their purpose in that way. "Can we not bear the smoke?" "Bar it. You're green, young feller. Do 'ee know what sort of brush they're a-totin' yonder?" "No," said I. "What is it?" "It are the stink plant, then, and the stinkiest plants 'ee ever smelt, I reckon. The smoke o' it would choke a skunk out o' a persimmon log. I tell 'ee, young un, we'll either be smoked out or smothered where we are. And this child ain't fit Injun for 30 year nor better to go under that away. When it gits to its wust, I'm a-going to make a rush. That's what I'm a-going to do, young feller." "But how?" I asked hurriedly. "How shall we act then?" "How? You're game to the toes, ain't ye?" "I'm willing to fight to the last." "Wall, then, here's how, and the only how. When they've raised the smoke so that they can't see us a-comin', we'll streak out among 'em. You hev the pistol, and can go foremost. Shoot every nigger that clutches at ye, and run like blazes. I'll follow clost on your heels. If we can once get through the thick of 'em, we mout make the brush and creep under it to the big caves on t'other side. Them caves jines one another, and we mout dodge them thur. I seed the time this coon could ha' run a bit, but these here jaints ain't as supple as they were onct. We can try nevertheless, and mind, young feller, it's our only chance. Do 'ee hear?" I promised to follow the directions that my never despairing companion had given me. "They won't get old Rube's scalp yit, they won't." I turned towards him. The man was actually laughing at this wild and strangely timed jest. It was awful to hear him. Several armfuls of brush were now thrown into the mouth of the cave. I saw that it was the creosote plant, the ideodondo. It was thrown upon the still blazing torch, and soon caught, sending up a thick black smoke. More was piled on, and the fetid vapor, impelled by some influence from without, began to reach our nostrils and lungs, causing an almost instantaneous feeling of sickness and suffocation. I could not have borne it long. I did not stay to try how long, for at that moment I heard Rube crying out, "Now's your time, young feller! Out and gi' 'em fits!" With a feeling of desperate resolve, I clutched my pistol and dashed through the smoking brushwood. I heard a wild and deafening shout. I saw a crowd of men, of fiends. I saw spears and tomahawks and red knives raised, and... End of section 48. Chapter 49 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scalp Hunters, by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 49. A Novel Mode of Equitation. When consciousness returned, I found that I was lying on the ground, and my dog, the innocent cause of my captivity, was licking my face. I could not have been long senseless, for the savages were still gesticulating violently around me. One was waving them back. I recognized him. It was Dacoma. The chief uttered a short harangue that seemed to quiet the warriors. I could not tell what he said, but I heard him use frequently the word Quetzalcoatl. I knew that this was the name of their god, but I did not understand at the time what the saving of my life could have to do with him. I thought that Dacoma was protecting me from some feeling of pity or gratitude, and I endeavored to recollect whether I had shown him any special act of kindness during his captivity. I had sadly mistaken the motives of that splendid savage. My head felt sore. Had they scalped me? With the thought, I raised my hand, passing it over my crown. No, my favorite brown curls were still there. But there was a deep cut along the back of my head, the dent of a tomahawk. I had been struck from behind as I came out, and before I could fire a single bullet. Where was Rube? I raised myself a little and looked around. He was not to be seen anywhere. Had he escaped as he intended? No. It would have been impossible for any man with only a knife to have fought his way through so many. Moreover, I did not observe any commotion among the savages, as if an enemy had escaped them. None seemed to have gone off from the spot. What then had... Ha! Now I understood, in its proper sense, Rube's jest about his scalp. It was not a double entendre, but a mote of triple ambiguity. The trapper, instead of following me, had remained quietly in his den, where no doubt he was at that moment watching me, his scapegoat, and chuckling at his own escape. The Indians, never dreaming that there were two of us in the cave, and satisfied that it was now empty, made no further attempts to smoke it. I was not likely to undeceive them. I knew that Rube's death or capture could not have benefited me, but I could not help reflecting on the strange stratagem by which the old fox had saved himself. I was not allowed much time for reflection. Two of the savages, seizing me by the arms, dragged me up to the still blazing ruin. Oh, heavens! Was it for this Dacoma had saved me from their tomahawks? For this, the most cruel of deaths? They proceeded to tie me hand and foot. Several others were around, submitting to the same treatment. I recognized Sanchez, the bullfighter, and the red-haired Irishman. There were 3 others of the band, whose names I had never learnt. We were in an open space in front of the burning ranch. We could see all that was going on. The Indians were clearing it of the fallen and charred timbers to get at the bodies of their friends. I watched their proceedings with less interest, as I now knew that Seguin was not there. It was a horrid spectacle when the rubbish was cleared away, laying bare the floor of the ruin. More than a dozen bodies lay upon it, half baked, half roasted. Their dresses were burned off. but by the parts that remained still intact from the fire, we could easily recognize to what party each had belonged. The greater number of them were Navajos. There were also the bodies of hunters smoking inside their cindery shirts. I thought of Garry, but as far as I could judge, he was not among them. There were no scalps for the Indians to take. The fire had been before them, and had not left a hair upon the heads of their dead foemen. Seemingly mortified at this, they lifted the bodies of the hunters, and tossed them once more into the flames that were still blazing up from the piled rafters. They gathered the knives, pistols, and tomahawks that lay among the ashes, and carrying what remained of their own people out of the ruin, placed them in front. They then stood around them in a circle, and with loud voices chanted a chorus of vengeance. During all this proceeding we lay where we had been thrown, guarded by a dozen savages. We were filled with fearful apprehensions. We saw the fire still blazing, and we saw that the bodies of our late comrades had been thrown upon it. We dreaded a similar fate for our own. But we soon found that we were reserved for some other purpose. 6 mules were brought up, and upon these we were mounted in a novel fashion. We were first set astride on the bare backs, with our faces turned tailwards. Our feet were then drawn under the necks of the animals, where our ankles were closely corded together. We were next compelled to bend down our bodies until we lay along the backs of the mules, our chins resting on their rumps. In this position our arms were drawn down until our hands met underneath, where they were tied tightly by the wrists. The attitude was painful, and to add to this, our mules, not used to be thus packed, kicked and plunged over the ground to the great mirth of our captors. This cruel sport was kept up even after the mules themselves had got tired of it, by the savages pricking the animals with their spears and placing branches of the cactus under their tails. We were fainting when it ended. Our captors now divided themselves into 2 parties, and started up the barranca, taking opposite sides. One went with the Mexican captives and the girls and children of the tribe. The larger party, under Dacoma, now head chief, for the other had been killed in the conflict, guarded us. We were carried up that side on which was the spring, and arriving at the water were halted for the night. We were taken off the mules and securely tied to one another, our guard watching us without intermission till morning. We were then packed as before, and carried westward across the desert. End of chapter 49.
Chapter 50 of The Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 50. A Fast Die. After a 4 days' journey, painful even to be remembered, we re-entered the valley of Navajoa. The other captives, along with the great caballada, had arrived before us, and we saw the plundered cattle scattered over the plain. As we approached the town, we were met by crowds of women and children, far more than we had seen on our former visit. These were guests who had come in from other villages of the Navajos that lay farther to the north. They were there to witness the triumphant return of the warriors, and partake of the great feast that always follows a successful foray. I noticed many white faces among them, with features of the Iberian race. They had been captives. They were now the wives of warriors. They were dressed like the others, and seemed to participate in the general joy. They, like Seguin's daughter, had been Indianized. There were many mestizos, half-bloods, the descendants of Indians and their Mexican captives, the offspring of many a Sabine wedding. We were carried through the streets and out to the western side of the village. The crowd followed us with mingled exclamations of triumph, hatred, and curiosity. At the distance of 100 yards or so from the houses, and close to the river bank, our guards drew up. I had turned my eyes on all sides as we passed through. As well as my awkward position would permit, I could see nothing of her, or any of the female captives. Where could they be? Perhaps in the temple. This building stood on the opposite side of the town, and the houses prevented me seeing it. Its top only was visible from the spot where we had been halted. We were untied and taken down. We were happy at being relieved from the painful attitude in which we had ridden all the way. We congratulated ourselves that we should now be allowed to sit upright. Our self-congratulation was brief. We soon found that the change was from the frying pan into the fire. We were only to be turned. We had hitherto lain upon our bellies; we were now to be laid upon our backs. In a few moments the change was accomplished, our captors handling us as unceremoniously as though we had been inanimate things. Indeed, we were nearly so. We were spread upon the green turf on our backs. Around each man 4 long pins were driven into the ground, in the form of a parallelogram. Our arms and legs were stretched out to their widest, and rawhide thongs were looped about our wrists and ankles. These were passed over the pins, and drawn so tightly that our joints cracked with the cruel tension. Thus we lay, faces upturned, like so many hides spread out to be sun-dried. We were placed in 2 ranks, endways, in such a manner that the heads of the front rank men rested between the feet of their respective rears. As there were 6 of us in all, we formed 3 files, with short intervals between. Our attitudes and fastenings left us without the power of moving a limb. The only member over which we had any control was the head; and this, thanks to the flexibility of our necks, we could turn about, so as to see what was going on in front or on either side of us. As soon as we were fairly staked down, I had the curiosity to raise my head and look around me. I found that I was rear rank, right file, and that my file leader was the ci devant soldier O'Cork. The Indian guards, after having stripped us of most of our clothing, left us, and the girls and squaws now began to crowd around. I noticed that they were gathering in front of my position, and forming a dense circle around the Irishman. I was struck with their ludicrous gestures, and their strange exclamations, and the puzzled expression of their countenances. "Ta-ya! Ta-ya!" cried they, and the whole crowd burst into shrill screams of laughter. What could it mean? Barney was evidently the subject of their mirth, but what was there about him to cause it, more than about any of the rest of us? I raised my head to ascertain. The riddle was solved at once. One of the Indians, in going off, had taken the Irishman's cap with him, and the little round red head was exposed to view. It lay midway between my feet, like a luminous ball, and I saw that it was the object of diversion. By degrees the squaws drew nearer, until they were huddled up in a thick crowd around the body of our comrade. At length one of them stooped and touched the head, drawing back her fingers with a start and a gesture as though she had burned them. This elicited fresh peals of laughter, and very soon all the women of the village were around the Irishman, scrouging one another to get a closer view. None of the rest of us were heeded, except to be liberally trampled upon, and 6 big heavy squaws were standing upon my limbs, the better to see over one another's shoulders. As there was no great stock of clothing to curtain the view, I could see the Irishman's head gleaming like a meteor through the forest of ankles. After a while the squaws grew less delicate in their touch, and catching hold of the short stiff bristles, endeavoured to pluck them out, all the while screaming with laughter. I was neither in the state of mind nor the attitude to enjoy a joke, but there was a language in the back of Barney's head, an expression of patient endurance, that would have drawn smiles from a grave digger, and Sanchez and the others were laughing aloud. For a long time our comrade endured the infliction, and remained silent, but at length it became too painful for his patience, and he began to speak out. "Arrah, now, girls," said he, in a tone of good-humoured entreaty, "will yez be aisy? Did yez never see red hair afore?" The squaws, on hearing the appeal, which of course they understood not, only showed their white teeth in loud laughter. "In troth, an' I've had yez on the sod at the old Cove o' Cark beyant, I could show yez as much av it is 'ud content ye for ye lives. Arrah, now, keep off me. Be the powers, you're trampin' the toes off me feet. Ach! Don't rug me. Holy Mother, will yez leave me alone? Devil resave you for the set of—" The tone in which the last words were uttered showed that O'Cork had at length lost his temper; but this only increased the assiduity of his tormentors, whose mirth now broke beyond bounds. They plucked him harder than ever, yelling all the while, so that, although he continued to scold, I could only hear him at intervals ejaculating, "Mother of Moses! Tarn nages! Holy Vismant!" and a variety of similar exclamations. This scene continued for several minutes, and then, all at once, there was a lull and a consultation among the women that told us they were devising some scheme. Several girls were sent off to the houses. These presently returned, bringing a large olla and another vessel of smaller dimensions. What did they intend to do with these? We soon learned. The olla was filled with water from the adjacent stream, and carried up, and the smaller vessel was set down beside Barney's head. We saw that it contained the yucca soap of the northern Mexicans. They were going to wash out the red. The Irishman's hand stays were now loosened, so that he could sit upright, and a copious coat of the soft soap was laid on his head, completely covering his hair. A couple of sinewy squaws then took hold of him by the shoulders, and with bunches of bark fibers applied the water, and scrubbed it in lustily. The application seemed to be anything but pleasant to Barney, who roared out, ducking his head on all sides to avoid it. But this did not serve him. One of the squaws seized the head between her hands and held it steady, while the other set to it afresh and rubbed harder than ever. The Indians yelled and danced around, but in the midst of all I could hear Barney sneezing and shouting in a smothered voice, "Holy Mother! Ch! Ch! Yes, may rub! Ch! Till ye fetch the skin off! Ah! Ch! Ch! And it won't ch! Come out! I tell ye, ch! Ch! It's in the grain! Ich! Ch! It won't come out! Ich! Ich! Be me soul, it won't! Ach! Ich! Ich!" But the poor fellow's expostulations were in vain. The scrubbing continued, and with fresh applications of the yucca, for 10 minutes or more, and then the great olla was lifted, and its contents dashed upon his head and shoulders. What was the astonishment of the women to find that instead of modifying the red colour, it only showed forth, if possible, more vivid than ever. Another olla of water was lifted and soused about the Irishman's ears, but with no better effect. Barney had not had such a washing for many a day, at least, not since he had been under the hands of the regimental barber. When the squaws saw that, in spite of all their efforts, the dyes still stuck fast, they desisted, and our comrade was again staked down. His bed was not so dry as before, neither was mine, for the water had saturated the ground about us, and we lay in mud. But this was a small vexation, compared with many others we were forced to put up with. For a long time the Indian women and children clustered around us, each in turn minutely examining the head of our comrade. We too came in for a share of their curiosity, but O'Cork was the elephant. They had seen hair like ours oftentimes upon their Mexican captives, but beyond a doubt Barney's was the first red poll that had ever been scratched in the valley of Navajoa. Darkness came on at length, and the squaws returned to the village, leaving us in charge of the guards, who all the night sat watchfully beside. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Scalp Hunters by Mayne REID. Chapter 51. Astonishing the Natives. Up to this time we had no knowledge of the fate that was designed for us, but from all that we had ever heard of these savages, as well as from our own experience of them, we anticipated that it would be a cruel one. Sanchez, however, who knew something of their language, left us no room to doubt such a result. He had gathered from the conversation of the women what was before us. After these had gone away he unfolded the programme as he had heard it. "Tomorrow," said he, "they will dance the Mamanchic, the great dance of Montezuma. That is a fete among the girls and women. Next day will be a grand tournament, in which the warriors will exhibit their skill in shooting with the bow, in wrestling, and in feats of horsemanship. If they would let me join them, I could show them how." Sancho, besides being an accomplished torero, had spent his earlier years in the circus, and was, as we all knew, a most splendid horseman. "On the third day," continued he, "we are to run amuck, if you know what that is." We had all heard of it. "And on the fourth?" "Well, upon the fourth, they will roast us." We might have been more startled at this abrupt declaration had the idea been new to us, but it was not. The probability of such an end had been in our thoughts ever since our capture. We knew that they did not save us at the mine for the purpose of giving us an easier death; and we knew, too, that these savages never made men prisoners to keep them alive. Rube was an exception, but his story was a peculiar one, and he escaped only by his extreme cunning. "Their god," continued Sanchez, "is the same as that of the Mexican Aztecs, for these people are of that race, it is believed. I don't know much about that, though I've heard men talk of it. He is called by a queer, hard name. Caray, I don't remember it." "Quetzalcoatl?" "Caval, that's the word. Pues, senores, he is a fire god, and fond of human flesh. Prefers it roasted, so they say. That's the use we'll be put to. They'll roast us to please him, and at the same time to satisfy themselves. Dos pajaros al un golpe." Two birds with one stone. That this was to be our fate was no longer probable, but certain; and we slept upon the knowledge of it the best way we could. In the morning we observed dressing and painting among the Indians. After that began dancing, the dance of the Mamanchic. This ceremony took place upon the prairie, at some distance out in front of the temple. As it was about commencing, we were taken from our spread positions and dragged up near it, in order that we might witness the glory of the nation. We were still tied, however, but allowed to sit upright. This was some relief, and we enjoyed the change of posture much more than the spectacle. I could not describe the dance even if I had watched it, which I did not. As Sanchez had said, it was carried on only by the women of the tribe. Processions of young girls, gaily and fantastically attired, and carrying garlands of flowers, circled and leaped through a variety of figures. There was a raised platform, upon which a warrior and maiden represented Montezuma and his queen, and around these the girls danced and chanted. The ceremony ended by the dancers kneeling in front in a grand semicircle. I saw that the occupants of the throne were Dacoma and Adele. I fancied that the girl looked sad. "Poor Seguin," thought I, "there is none to protect her now. Even the false father, the medicine chief, might have been her friend. He, too, is out of the way, and—" But I did not occupy much time with thoughts of her. There was a far more painful apprehension than that. My mind, as well as my eyes, had dwelt upon the temple during the ceremony. We could see it from the spot where we had been thrown down, but it was too distant for me to distinguish the faces of the white females that were clustered along its terraces. She, no doubt, was among them, but I was unable to make her out. Perhaps it was better I was not near enough. I thought so at the time. I saw Indian men among the captives, and I had observed Dacoma, previous to the commencement of the dance, proudly stand before them in all the paraphernalia of his regal robes. Rube had given me the character of this chief, brave but brutal. My heart was oppressed with a painful heaviness, as we were hurried back to our former places. Most of the next night was spent by the Indians in feasting. Not so with us. We were rarely and scantily fed, and we suffered too from thirst, our savage guards scarcely deigning to supply us with water, though a river was running at our feet. Another morning, and the feasting recommenced. More sheep and cattle were slaughtered, and the fires steamed anew with the red joints that were suspended over them. At an early hour the warriors arrayed themselves, though not in war attire, and the tournament commenced. We were again dragged forward to witness their savage sports, but placed still farther out on the prairie. I could distinguish upon the terrace of the temple the whitish dresses of the captives. The temple was their place of abode. Sanchez had told me this. He had learned it from the Indians as they conversed one with another. The girls were to remain there until the 5th day, that after our sacrifice. Then the chief would choose one of the number for his own household, and the warriors would gamble for the rest. Oh, these were fearful hours! Sometimes I wished that I could see her once again before I died, and then reflection whispered me, it was better not. The knowledge of my fate would only add fresh bitterness to hers. Oh, these were fearful hours! I looked at the savage tournament. These were feats of arms and feats of equitation. Men rode at a gallop, with one foot only to be seen over the horse, and in this attitude threw the javelin or shot the unerring shaft. Others vaulted from horse to horse as they swept over the prairie at racing speed. Some leaped to their saddles while their horses were running at a gallop, and some exhibited feats with the lasso. Then there was a mock encounter, in which the warriors unhorsed each other, as knights of the olden time. It was, in fact, a magnificent spectacle, a grand hippodrome of the desert, but I had no eyes for it. It had more attraction for Sanchez. I saw that he was observing every new feat with interested attention. All at once he became restless. There was a strange expression on his face. Some thought, some sudden resolve, had taken possession of him. "Say to your braves," said he, speaking to one of our guards in the Navajo tongue, "say that I can beat the best of them at that. I could teach them to ride a horse." The savage reported what his prisoner had said, and shortly after several mounted warriors rode up, and replied to the taunt. "You, a poor white slave, ride with the warriors of Navajo? Ha, ha, ha!" "Can you ride upon your head?" inquired the torero. "On our heads? How?" "Standing upon your head while your horse is in a gallop." "No, nor you, nor anyone. We are the best riders on the plains. We cannot do that." "I can," affirmed the bullfighter, with emphasis. "He is boasting. He is a fool," shouted several. "Let us see," cried one. "Give him a horse. There is no danger." "Give me my own horse, and I will show you." "Which is your horse?" "None of them now, I suppose. But bring me that spotted mustang, and clear me 100 lengths of him on the prairie, and I shall teach you a trick." As I looked to ascertain what horse Sanchez meant, I saw the mustang which he had ridden from the Del Norte. I noticed my own favourite too, browsing with the rest. After a short consultation among themselves, the torero's request was acceded to. The horse he had pointed out was lassoed out of the caballada and brought up, and our comrades' thongs were taken off. The Indians had no fear of his escaping. They knew that they could soon overtake such a steed as the spotted mustang. Moreover, there was a picket constantly kept at each entrance of the valley. Even could he beat them across the plains, it would be impossible for him to get to the open country. The valley itself was a prison. Sanchez was not long in making his preparations. He strapped a buffalo skin tightly on the back of his horse, and then led him around for some time in a circle, keeping him in the same track. After practising thus for a while, he dropped the bridle and uttered a peculiar cry, on hearing which the animal fell into a slow gallop around the circle. When the horse had accomplished 2 or 3 rounds, the torero leaped upon his back, and performed the well-known feat of riding on his head. Although a common one among professional equestrians, it was new to the Navajoes, who looked on with shouts of wonder and admiration. They caused the torero to repeat it again and again, until the spotted mustang had become all of one colour. Sanchez, however, did not leave off until he had given his spectators the full programme of the ring, and had fairly astonished the natives. When the tournament was ended, and we were hauled back to the riverside, the torero was not with us. Fortunate Sanchez! He had won his life. Henceforth he was to be riding master to the Navajo nation. End of chapter 51.
Chapter 52 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scalp Hunters, by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 52. Running Amuck. Another day came, our day for action. We saw our enemies making their preparations. We saw them go off to the woods, and return bringing clubs freshly cut from the trees. We saw them dress as for ball play or running. At an early hour we were taken forward to the front of the temple. On arriving there I cast my eyes upward to the terrace. My betrothed was above me. I was recognized. There was mud upon my scanty garments, and spots of blood. There was dust in my hair. There were scars upon my arms. My face and throat were stained with powder, blotches of black, burnt powder. In spite of all, I was recognized. The eyes of love saw through all. I find no scene in all my experience so difficult to describe as this. Why? There was none so terrible, none in which so many wild emotions were crowded into a moment. A love like ours, tantalized by proximity, almost within reach of each other's embrace, yet separated by relentless fate, and that forever. The knowledge of each other's situation, the certainty of my death, these and 100 kindred thoughts rushed into our hearts together. They could not be detailed. They cannot be described. Words will not express them. You may summon fancy to your aid. I heard her screams, her wild words and wilder weeping. I saw her snowy cheeks and streaming hair as frantic she rushed forward on the parapet as if to spring out. I witnessed her struggles as she was drawn back by her fellow captives, and then, all at once, she was quiet in their arms. She had fainted, and was borne out of my sight. I was tied by the wrists and ankles. During the scene I had twice risen to my feet, forced up by my emotions, but only to fall down again. I made no further effort, but lay upon the ground in the agony of impotence. It was but a short moment, but oh, the feelings that passed over my soul in that moment! It was the compressed misery of a lifetime. For a period of perhaps half an hour I regarded not what was going on around me. My mind was not abstracted, but paralyzed, absolutely dead. I had no thoughts about anything. I awoke at length from this stupor. I saw that the savages had completed their preparations for the cruel sport. 2 rows of men extended across the plain to a distance of several hundred yards. They were armed with clubs, and stood facing each other, with an interval of 3 or 4 paces between their ranks. Down the interval we were to run, receiving blows from every one who could give them as we passed. Should any of us succeed in running through the whole line, and reach the mountain foot before we could be overtaken, the promise was that our lives should be spared. "Is this true, Sanchez?" I whispered to the torero, who was standing near me. "No," was the reply, given also in a whisper. "It is only a trick to make you run better, and show them the more sport. You are to die all the same. I heard them say so." Indeed, it would have been slight grace had they given us our lives on such conditions, for it would have been impossible for the strongest and swiftest man to have passed through between their lines. "Sanchez," I said again, addressing the torero, "Seguin was your friend. You will do all you can for her?" Sanchez well knew whom I meant. I will," he replied, seeming deeply affected. "Brave Sanchez, tell her how I felt for her. No, you need not tell her that." I scarce knew what I was saying. "Sanchez," I again whispered, a thought that had been in my mind now returning, "could you not, a knife, a weapon, anything, could you not drop one when I am set loose?" "It would be of no use. You could not escape if you had 50. "It may be that I could not. I would try. At the worst I can but die, and better die with a weapon in my hands." "It would be better," muttered the torero in reply. "I will try to help you to a weapon, but my life may be—" He paused. "If you look behind you," he continued, in a significant manner, while he appeared to examine the tops of the distant mountains, "you may see a tomahawk. I think it is held carelessly. It might be snatched." I understood his meaning, and stole a glance around. Dacoma was at a few paces' distance, superintending the start. I saw the weapon in his belt. It was loosely stuck. It might be snatched. I possess extreme tenacity of life, with energy to preserve it. I have not illustrated this energy in the adventures through which we have passed, for up to a late period I was merely a passive spectator of the scenes enacted, and in general disgusted with their enactment. But at other times I have proved the existence of those traits in my character. In the field of battle, to my knowledge, I have saved my life 3 times by the quick perception of danger and the promptness to ward it off. Either less or more brave, I should have lost it. This may seem an enigma. It appears a puzzle. It is an experience. In my earlier life I was addicted to what are termed manly sports. In running and leaping I never met my superior, and my feats in such exercises are still recorded in the memories of my college companions. Do not wrong me, and think that I am boasting of these peculiarities. The first is but an accident in my mental character, and others are only rude accomplishments, which now, in my more matured life, I see but little reason to be proud of. I mention them only to illustrate what follows. Ever since the hour of my capture, I had busied my mind with plans of escape. Not the slightest opportunity had as yet offered. All along the journey we had been guarded with the most zealous vigilance. During this last night, a new plan had occupied me. It had been suggested by seeing Sanchez upon his horse. I had matured it all, except getting possession of a weapon, and I had hopes of escape, although I had neither time nor opportunity to detail them to the torero. It would have served no purpose to have told him them. I knew that I might escape, even without the weapon, but I needed it in case there might be in the tribe a faster runner than myself. I might be killed in the attempt, that was likely enough, but I knew that death could not come in a worse shape than that in which I was to meet it on the morrow. Weapon or no weapon, I was resolved to escape, or die in attempting it. I saw them untying O'Cork. He was to run first. There was a circle of savages around the starting point, old men and idlers of the village, who stood there only to witness the sport. There was no apprehension of our escaping. That was never thought of. An enclosed valley, with guards at each entrance, plenty of horses standing close by, that could be mounted in a few minutes. It would be impossible for any of us to get away from the ground. At least, so thought they. O'Cork started. Poor Barney, his race was not a long one. He had not run 10 paces down the living avenue when he was knocked over and carried back, bleeding and senseless, amidst the yells of the delighted crowd. Another of the men shared a similar fate, and another, and then they unbound me. I rose to my feet, and during the short interval allowed me, stretched my limbs, imbuing my soul and body with all the energy that my desperate circumstances enabled me to concentrate within them. The signal was again given for the Indians to be ready, and they were soon in their places, brandishing their long clubs, and impatiently waiting for me to make the start. Dacoma was behind me. With a side glance I had marked well where he stood, and backing towards him under pretense of getting a fairer break, I came close up to the savage. Then suddenly wheeling, with the spring of a cat and the dexterity of a thief, I caught the tomahawk and jerked it from his belt. I aimed a blow, but in my hurry missed him. I had no time for another. I turned and ran. He was so taken by surprise that I was out of his reach before he could make a motion to follow me. I ran, not for the open avenue, but to one side of the circle of spectators where were the old men and idlers. These had drawn their hand weapons, and were closing towards me in a thick rank. Instead of endeavoring to break through them, which I doubted my ability to accomplish, I threw all my energy into the spring, and leaped clear over their shoulders. 2 or 3 stragglers struck at me as I passed them, but missed their aim, and the next moment I was out upon the open plain, with the whole village yelling at my heels. I well knew for what I was running. Had it not been for that, I should never have made the start. I was running for the caballada. I was running, too, for my life, and it required no encouragement to induce me to make the best of it. I soon distanced those who had been nearest me at starting. But the swiftest of the Indians were the young men who had formed the lines, and I saw that these were now forging ahead of the others. Still they were not gaining upon me. My school training stood me in service now. After a mile's chase, I saw that I was within less than half of that distance of the caballada, and at least 300 yards ahead of my pursuers. But to my horror, as I glanced back, I saw mounted men. They were still far behind, but I knew they would soon come up. Was it possible he could hear me? I knew that in these elevated regions sounds are heard twice the ordinary distance, and I shouted at the top of my voice, "Moro! Moro!" I did not halt, but ran on, calling as I went. I saw a sudden commotion among the horses. Their heads were tossed up, and then one dashed out from the drove and came galloping towards me. I knew the broad black chest and red muzzle. I knew them at a glance. It was my brave steed, my Moro. The rest followed, trooping after, but before they were up to trample me, I had met my horse, and flung myself panting upon his back. I had no rein, but my favourite was used to the guidance of my voice, hands, and knees, and directing him through the herd, I headed for the western end of the valley. I heard the yells of the mounted savages as I cleared the caballada, and looking back I saw a string of 20 or more coming after me as fast as their horses could gallop. But I had no fear of them now. I knew my Moro too well, and after I had cleared the 10 miles of valley, and was springing up the steep front of the Sierra, I saw my pursuers still back upon the plain. End of chapter 52.
Chapter 53 of The Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 53. A Conflict Upon a Cliff. My horse, idle for days, had recovered his full action, and bore me up the rocky path with proud, springy step. My nerves drew vigour from his, and the strength of my body was fast returning. It was well. I would soon be called upon to use it. The picket was still to be passed. While escaping from the town, in the excitement of the more proximate peril, I had not thought of this ulterior one. I now remembered it. It flashed upon me of a sudden, and I commenced gathering my resolution to meet it. I knew there was a picket upon the mountain. Sanchez had said so. He had heard them say so. What number of men composed it? Sanchez had said 2, but he was not certain of this. 2 would be enough, more than enough for me, still weak, and armed as I was with a weapon in the use of which I had little skill. How would they be armed? Doubtless with bows, lances, tomahawks, and knives. The odds were all against me. At what point should I find them? They were vedettes. Their chief duty was to watch the plains without. They would be at some station, then, commanding a view of these. I remembered the road well, the same by which we had first entered the valley. There was a platform near the western brow of the sierra. I recollected it, for we had halted upon it while our guide went forward to reconnoitre. A cliff overhung this platform. I remembered that, too, for during the absence of the guide, Seguin and I had dismounted and climbed it. It commanded a view of the whole outside country to the south and west. No doubt, then, on that very cliff would the vedettes be stationed. Would they be on its top? If so, it might be best to make a dash, and pass them before they could descend to the road, running the risk of their missiles, their arrows, and lances. Make a dash? No, that would be impossible. I remembered that the path at both ends of the platform narrowed to the width of only a few feet, with the cliff rising above it, and the canon yawning below. It was, in fact, only a ledge of the precipice, along which it was dangerous to pass even at a walk. Moreover, I had reshod my horse at the mission. The iron was worn smooth, and I knew that the rock was as slippery as glass. All these thoughts passed through my mind as I neared the summit of the sierra. The prospect was appalling. The peril before me was extreme, and under other circumstances I would have hesitated to encounter it. But I knew that that which threatened from behind was not less desperate. There was no alternative, and with only half-formed resolutions as to how I should act, I pushed forward. I rode with caution, directing my horse as well as I could upon the softer parts of the trail, so that his hoof-strokes might not be heard. At every turn I halted, and scanned the profile of each new prospect. But I did not halt longer than I could help. I knew that I had no time to waste. The road ascended through a thin wood of cedars and dwarf piñons. It would zigzag up the face of the mountain. Near the crest of the sierra it turned sharply to the right, and trended in to the brow of the canon. There the ledge already mentioned became the path, and the road followed its narrow terrace along the very face of the precipice. On reaching this point I caught view of the cliff where I expected to see the vidette. I had guessed correctly. He was there, and to my agreeable surprise there was only one, a single savage. He was seated upon the very topmost rock of the sierra, and his large brown body was distinctly visible, outlined against the pale blue sky. He was not more than 300 yards from me, and about a third of that distance above the level of the ledge along which I had to pass. I halted the moment I caught sight of him, and sat making a hurried reconnaissance. As yet he had neither seen nor heard me. His back was to me, and he appeared to be gazing intently towards the west. Beside the rock on which he was, his spear was sticking in the ground, and his shield, bow, and quiver were leaning against it. I could see upon his person the sparkle of a knife and tomahawk. I have said my reconnaissance was a hurried one. I was conscious of the value of every moment, and almost at a glance I formed my resolution. That was, to run the gauntlet, and attempt passing before the Indian could descend to intercept me. Obedient to this impulse, I gave my animal the signal to move forward. I rode slowly and cautiously for two reasons: because my horse dared not go otherwise, and I thought that, by riding quietly, I might get beyond the vidette without attracting his notice. The torrent was hissing below. Its roar ascended to the cliff. It might drown the sound of the hoof strokes. With this hope I stole onward. My eye passed rapidly from one to the other, from the savage on the cliff to the perilous path along which my horse crawled, shivering with affright. When I had advanced about 6 lengths upon the ledge, the platform came in view, and with it a group of objects that caused me to reach suddenly forward and grasp the forelock of my Moro, a sign by which, in the absence of a bit, I could always halt him. He came at once to a stand, and I surveyed the objects before me with a feeling of despair. They were 2 horses, mustangs, and a man, an Indian. The mustangs, bridled and saddled, were standing quietly out upon the platform, and a lasso, tied to the bit ring of one of them, was coiled around the wrist of the Indian. The latter was sitting upon his hams, close up to the cliff, so that his back touched the rock. His arms lay horizontally across his knees, and upon these his head rested. I saw that he was asleep. Beside him were his bow and quiver, his lance and shield, all leaning against the cliff. My situation was a terrible one. I knew that I could not pass him without being heard, and I knew that pass him I must. In fact, I could not have gone back, had I wished it, for I had already entered upon the ledge, and was riding along a narrow shelf, where my horse could not possibly have turned himself. All at once the idea entered my mind that I might slip to the ground, steal forward, and with my tomahawk. It was a cruel thought, but it was the impulse of instinct, the instinct of self-preservation. It was not decreed that I should adopt so fearful an alternative. Moro, impatient at being delayed in the perilous position, snorted and struck the rock with his hoof. The clink of the iron was enough for the sharp ears of the Spanish horses. They neighed on the instant. The savages sprang to their feet, and their simultaneous yell told me that both had discovered me. I saw the vidette upon the cliff pluck up his spear, and commenced hurrying downward. But my attention was soon exclusively occupied with his comrade. The latter, on seeing me, had leaped to his feet, seized his bow, and vaulted, as if mechanically, upon the back of his mustang. Then, uttering a wild shout, he trotted over the platform, and advanced along the ledge to meet me. An arrow whizzed past my head as he came up, but in his hurry he had aimed badly. Our horses' heads met. They stood muzzle to muzzle, with eyes dilated, their red nostrils steaming into each other. Both snorted fiercely, as if each was imbued with the wrath of his rider. They seemed to know that a death strife was between us. They seemed conscious, too, of their own danger. They had met at the very narrowest part of the ledge. Neither could have turned or backed off again. One or other must go over the cliff, must fall through a depth of 1,000 feet into the stony channel of the torrent. I sat with a feeling of utter helplessness. I had no weapon with which I could reach my antagonist, no missile. He had his bow, and I saw him adjusting a second arrow to the string. At this crisis 3 thoughts passed through my mind, not as I detail them here, but following each other like quick flashes of lightning. My first impulse was to urge my horse forward, trusting to his superior weight to precipitate the lighter animal from the ledge. Had I been worth a bridle and spurs, I should have adopted this plan, but I had neither, and the chances were too desperate without them. I abandoned it for another. I would hurl my tomahawk at the head of my antagonist. No! The third thought: I will dismount and use my weapon upon the mustang. This last was clearly the best, and, obedient to its impulse, I slipped down between Moro and the cliff. As I did so, I heard the hiss of another arrow passing my cheek. It had missed me from the suddenness of my movements. In an instant I squeezed past the flanks of my horse, and glided forward upon the ledge, directly in front of my adversary. The animal, seeming to guess my intentions, snorted with affright, and reared up, but was compelled to drop again into the same tracks. The Indian was fixing another shaft. Its notch never reached the string. As the hoofs of the mustang came down upon the rock, I aimed my blow. I struck the animal over the eye. I felt the skull yielding before my hatchet, and the next moment horse and rider, the latter screaming and struggling to clear himself of the saddle, disappeared over the cliff. There was a moment's silence, a long moment, in which I knew they were falling down that fearful depth. Then came a loud splash, the concussion of their united bodies on the water below. I had no curiosity to look over, and as little time. When I regained my upright attitude, for I had come to my knees in giving the blow, I saw the vidette just leaping upon the platform. He did not halt a moment, but advanced at a run, holding his spear at the charge. I saw that I should be impaled unless I could parry the thrust. I struck wildly, but with success. The lance blade glinted from the head of my weapon. Its shaft passed me, and our bodies met with a shock that caused us both to reel upon the very edge of the cliff. As soon as I had recovered my balance, I followed up my blows, keeping close to my antagonist, so that he could not again use his lance. Seeing this, he dropped the weapon and drew his tomahawk. We now fought hand to hand, hatchet to hatchet. Backward and forward along the ledge we drove each other, as the advantage or the blows told in favour of either or against him. Several times we grappled, and would have pushed each other over, but the fear that each felt of being dragged after mutually restrained us, and we let go, and trusted again to our tomahawks. Not a word passed between us. We had nothing to say, even could we have understood each other. But we had no boast to make, no taunt to urge, nothing before our minds but the fixed, dark purpose of murdering one another. After the first onset the Indian had ceased yelling, and we both fought in the intense earnestness of silence. There was sounds, though, an occasional sharp exclamation, our quick, high breathing, the clicking of our tomahawks, the neighing of our horses, and the continuous roar of the torrent. These were the symphonies of our conflict. For some minutes we battled upon the ledge. We were both cut and bruised in several places, but neither of us had as yet received or inflicted a mortal wound. At length, after a continuous shower of blows, I succeeded in beating my adversary back, until we found ourselves out upon the platform. There we had ample room to wind our weapons, and we struck with more energy than ever. After a few strokes, our tomahawks met, with a violent concussion that sent them flying from our hands. Neither dared stoop to regain his weapon, and we rushed upon each other with naked arms, clutched, wrestled a moment, and then fell together to the earth. I thought my antagonist had a knife. I must have been mistaken, otherwise he would have used it; but without it I soon found that in the species of encounter he was my master. His muscular arms encircled me until my ribs cracked under the embrace. We rolled along the ground, over and over each other. Oh God, we were nearing the edge of the precipice. I could not free myself from his grasp. His sinewy fingers were across my throat. They clasped me tightly around the trachea, stopping my breath. He was strangling me. I grew weak and nerveless. I could resist no longer. I felt my hold relax. I grew weaker and weaker. I was dying. Oh, heaven! Pardon! Oh! I could not have been long insensible, for when consciousness returned I was still warm, sweating from the effects of the struggle, and my wounds were bleeding freshly and freely. I felt that I yet lived. I saw that I was still upon the platform. But where was my antagonist? Why had not he finished me? Why had not he flung me over the cliff? I rose upon my elbow and looked around. I could see no living things but my own horse and that of the Indian galloping over the platform, kicking and plunging at each other. But I heard sounds of fearful import, like the hoarse, angry worrying of dogs, mingling with the cries of a human voice, a voice uttered in agony. What could it mean? I saw that there was a break in the platform, a deep cut in the rock, and out of this the sounds appeared to issue. I rose to my feet, and trotting towards the spot, looked in. It was an awful sight to look upon. The gully was some 10 feet in depth, and at its bottom, among the weeds and cacti, a huge dog was engaged in tearing something that screamed and struggled. It was a man, an Indian. All was explained at a glance. The dog was Alp. The man was my late antagonist. As I came upon the edge, the dog was on top of his adversary, and kept himself uppermost by desperate bounds. from side to side, still dashing the other back as he attempted to rise to his feet. The savage was crying in despair. I thought I saw the teeth of the animal fast in his throat, but I watched the struggle no longer. Voices from behind caused me to turn round. My pursuers had reached the canyon, and were urging their animals along the ledge. I staggered to my horse, and springing upon his back, once more directed him to the terrace, that part which led outward. In a few minutes I had cleared the cliff and was hurrying down the mountain. As I approached its foot I heard a rustling in the bushes that on both sides lined the path. Then an object sprang out a short distance behind me. It was the Saint Bernard. As he came alongside he uttered a low whimper, and once or twice wagged his tail. I knew not how he could have escaped, for he must have waited until the Indians reached the platform. But the fresh blood that stained his jaws and clotted the shaggy hair upon his breast showed that he had left one with but little power to detain him. On reaching the plain I looked back. I saw my pursuers coming down the face of the sierra, but I had still nearly a half mile of start, and taking the snowy mountain for my guide, I struck out into the open prairie. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of The Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 54. An Unexpected Encontre. As I rode off from the mountain foot, the white peak glistened at a distance of 30 miles. There was not a hillock between, not a brake or bush, excepting the low shrubs of the artemisia. It was not yet noon. Could I reach the snowy mountains before sunset? If so, I trusted in being able to follow our old trail to the mine. Thence I might keep on to the Del Norte by striking a branch of the Paloma or some other lateral stream. Such were my plans, undefined as I rode forth. I knew that I should be pursued almost to the gates of El Paso, and when I had ridden forward about a mile, a glance to the rear showed me that the Indians had just reached the plain, and were striking out after me. It was no longer a question of speed. I knew that I had the heels of their whole cavalcade. Did my horse possess the bottom? I knew the tireless, wiry nature of the Spanish mustang, and their animals were of that race. I knew they could gallop for a long day without breaking down, and this led me to fear for the result. Speed was nothing now, and I made no attempt to keep it up. I was determined to economize the strength of my steed. I could not be overtaken so long as he lasted, and I galloped slowly forward, watching the movements of my pursuers, and keeping a regular distance ahead of them. At times I dismounted to relieve my horse, and ran alongside of him. My dog followed, occasionally looking up in my face, and seemingly conscious why I was making such a hurried journey. During all the day I was never out of sight of the Indians. In fact, I could have distinguished their arms and counted their numbers at any time. There were in all about a score of horsemen. The stragglers had gone back, and only the well-mounted men now continued the pursuit. As I neared the foot of the snowy peak, I remembered there was water at our old camping ground in the pass, and I pushed my horse faster, in order to gain time to refresh both him and myself. I intended to make a short halt, and allow the noble brute to breathe himself and snatch a bite of the bunch grass that grew around the spring. There was nothing to fear so long as his strength held out, and I knew that this was the plan to sustain it. It was near sundown as I entered the defile. Before riding in among the rocks, I looked back. During the last hour I had gained upon my pursuers. They were still at least 3 miles out upon the plain, and I saw that they were toiling on wearily. I fell into a train of reflection as I rode down the ravine. I was now upon a known trail. My spirits rose. My hopes, so long clouded over, began to assume a brightness and buoyancy greater from the very influence of reaction. I should still be able to rescue my betrothed. My whole energies, my fortune, my life, would be devoted to this one object. I would raise a band stronger than ever Seguin had commanded. I should get followers among the returning employees of the caravan, teamsters whose term of service had expired. I would search the posts and mountain rendezvous for trappers and hunters. I would apply to the Mexican government for aid, in money, in troops. I would appeal to the citizens of El Paso, of Chihuahua, of Durango. Jehoshaphat! Here's a feller ridin' without either saddle or bridle." 5 or 6 men with rifles sprang out from the rocks, surrounding me. "May an Injun eat me, if 'tain't the young feller as took me for a grizzly! Billy, look here! Here he is, the very feller! He! Rube! Garey! What, by Jove! It's my friend Haller! Hooray, old fellow, don't you know me?" "Saint Vrain! That it is. Don't I look like him? It would have been a harder task to identify you, but for what the old trapper has been telling us about you. But come, how have you got out of the hands of the Philistines? First tell me who you all are. What are you doing here?" "Oh, we're a picket. The army is below." "The army? Why, we call it so. There's 600 of us, and that's about as big an army as usually travels in these parts." "But who? What are they?" "They are of all sorts and colours. There's the Chihuahuanos, and Paisanos, and niggers, and hunters, and trappers, and teamsters. Your humble servant commands these last named gentry. And then there's the band of your friend Seguin." "Seguin? Is he—" "What? He's at the head of all. But come, they're camped down by the spring. Let us go down. You don't look overfed. And, old fellow, there's a drop of the best Paso in my saddle bags. Come." "Stop a moment. I am pursued." "Pursued?" echoed the hunters, simultaneously raising their rifles and looking up the ravine. "How many?" "About 20. "Are they close upon you?" "No." "How long before we may expect them?" "They are 3 miles back, with tired horses, as you may suppose." "3/4. Halt an hour at any rate. Come, we'll have time to go down and make arrangements for their reception. Rube, you with the rest can remain here. We shall join you before they get forward. Come, Haller, come." Following my faithful and warm-hearted friend, I rode on to the spring. Around it I found the army, and it had somewhat of that appearance, for 200 or 300 of the men were in uniform. These were the volunteer guards of Chihuahua and El Paso. The late raid of the Indians had exasperated the inhabitants, and this unusually strong muster was the consequence. Seguin, with the remnant of his band, had met them at El Paso, and hurried them forward on the Navajo trail. It was from him Saint Vrain had heard of my capture, and in hopes of rescuing me had joined the expedition with about 40 or 50 employees of the caravan. Most of Seguin's band had escaped after the fight in the barranca, and among the rest, I was rejoiced to hear, El Sol and La Luna. They were now on their return with Seguin, and I found them at his tent. Seguin welcomed me as the bearer of joyful news. They were still safe. That was all I could tell him, and all he asked for during our hurried congratulation. We had no time for idle talk. 100 men immediately mounted and rode up the ravine. On reaching the ground occupied by the picket, they led their horses behind the rocks, and formed an ambuscade. The order was that all the Indians must be killed or taken. The plan hastily agreed upon was, to let them pass the ambushed men, and ride on until they had got in sight of the main body. Then both divisions were to close upon them. It was a dry ravine above the spring, and the horses had made no tracks upon its rocky bed. Moreover, the Indians, ardent in their pursuit of me, would not be on the lookout for any sign before reaching the water. Should they pass the ambuscade, then not a man of them would escape, as the defile on both sides was walled in by a precipice. After the others had gone, about 100 men at the spring leaped into their saddles, and sat with their eyes bent up the pass. They were not long kept waiting. A few minutes after the ambuscade had been placed, an Indian showed himself round an angle of the rock, about 200 yards above the spring. He was the foremost of the warriors, and must have passed the ambushed horsemen, but as yet the latter lay still. Seeing a body of men, the savage halted with a quick jerk, and then uttering a cry, wheeled and rode back upon his comrades. These, imitating his example, wheeled also, but before they had fairly turned themselves in the ravine, the cached horsemen sprang out in a body from the rocks and came galloping down. The Indians, now seeing that they were completely in the trap, with overpowering numbers on both sides of them, threw down their spears and begged for mercy. In a few minutes they were all captured. The whole affair did not occupy half an hour, and with our prisoners securely tied, we returned to the spring. The leading men now gathered around Seguin to settle on some plan for attacking the town. Should we move on to it that night? I was asked for my advice, and of course answered, yes, the sooner the better, for the safety of the captives. My feelings, as well as those of Seguin, could not brook delay. Besides, several of our late comrades were to die on the morrow. We might still be in time to save them. How were we to approach the valley? This was the next point to be discussed. The enemy would now be certain to have their vedettes at both ends, and it promised to be clear moonlight until morning. They could easily see such a large body approaching from the open plain. Here, then, was a difficulty. "Let us divide," said one of Seguin's old band. "Let a party go in at each end. That'll get 'em in the trap." "Wagh!" replied another. "That would never do. There's 10 miles of rough wood there. If we raised the niggers by such a show as this, they'd take to them, gals and all, and that's the last we'd see of 'em." This speaker was clearly in the right. It would never do to make our attack openly. Stratagem must again be used. A head was now called into the council that soon mastered the difficulty, as it had many another. That was the skinless, earless head of the trapper Rube. "Cap," said he, after a short delay, "'ee needn't show your crowd till we first took the lookouts by the end of the canon." "How can we take them?" inquired Seguin. "Strip them 20 niggers," replied Rube, pointing to our captives, "and let 20 of us put on their duds. Then we can take the young feller, him here as took me for the grizzly, he, he, he. Old Rube took for a grizzly. We can take him back a prisoner. Now, Cap, do you see how?" "You would have these 20 to keep far in advance then, capture the vedettes, and wait till the main body comes up?" "Sartinly. That's my idee adzactly." "It is the best, the only one. We shall follow it." And Seguin immediately ordered the Indians to be stripped of their dresses. These consisted mostly of garments that had been plundered from the people of the Mexican towns, and were of all cuts and colours. "I'd recommend 'ee, Cap," suggested Rube, seeing that Seguin was looking out to choose the men for his advance party. "I'd recommend 'ee to take a smart sprinklin' of the Delawars. Them Navajos is mighty cute, and not easily bamfoozled. They might sight white skin by moonlight. Them of us that must go along will have to paint Injun, or we'll be fooled after all, we will." Seguin, taking this hint, selected for the advance most of the Delaware and Shawano Indians, and these were now dressed in the clothes of the Navajoes. He himself, with Rube, Garey, and a few other whites, made up the required number. I, of course, was to go along and play the role of a prisoner. The whites of the party soon accomplished their change of dress and painted Injun, a trick of the prairie toilet well known to all of them. Rube had but little change to make. His hue was already of sufficient deepness for the disguise, and he was not going to trouble himself by throwing off the old shirt or leggings. That could hardly have been done without cutting both open, and Rube was not likely to make such a sacrifice of his favourite buckskins. He proceeded to draw the other garments over them, and in a short time was habited in a pair of slashing calzoneros, with bright buttons from the hip to the ankle. These, with a smart, tight-fitting jacket that had fallen to his share, and a jaunty sombrero cocked upon his head, gave him the air of a most comical dandy. The men fairly yelled at seeing him thus metamorphosed, and old Rube himself grinned heartily at the odd feelings which the dress occasioned him. Before the sun had set, everything was in readiness, and the advance started off. The main body, under Saint Vrain, was to follow an hour after. A few men, Mexicans, remained by the spring, in charge of the Navajo prisoners. Chapter 54.
Chapter 55 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 55. THE RESCUE. We struck directly across the plain for the eastern entrance of the valley. We reached the canyon about 2 hours before day. Everything turned out as we had anticipated. There was an outpost of 5 Indians at the end of the pass, but we had stolen upon them unawares, and they were captured without the necessity of our firing a shot. The main body came up soon after, and preceded by our party as before, passed through the canyon. Arriving at the border of the woods nearest the town, we halted and concealed ourselves among the trees. The town was glistening in the clear moonlight, and deep silence was over the valley. There were none stirring at so early an hour, but we could descry 2 or 3 dark objects down by the river. We knew them to be the sentinels that stood over our captive comrades. The sight was gratifying, for it told us they still lived. They little dreamed, poor fellows, how near was the hour of their deliverance. For the same reasons that had influenced us on a former occasion, the attack was not to be made until daybreak, and we waited as before, but with a very different prospect. There were now 600 warriors in the town, about our own number, and we knew that a desperate engagement was before us. We had no fear as to the result, but we feared that the vengeful savages might take it into their heads to dispatch their captives while we fought. We knew that to recover these was our main object, and, if themselves defeated, that would give them the satisfaction of a terrible vengeance. All this we knew was far from improbable, but to guard against the possibility of such an event, every precaution was to be taken. We were satisfied that the captive women were still in the temple. Rube assured us that it was their universal custom to keep new prisoners there for several days after their arrival, until they were finally distributed among the warriors. The queen, too, dwelt in this building. It was resolved, then, that the disguised party should ride forward, conducting me, as their prisoner, by the first light, and that they should surround the temple, and by a clever coup secure the white captives. A signal then given on the bugle, or the first shot fired, was to bring the main body forward at a gallop. This was plainly the best plan, and having fully arranged its details, we waited the approach of the dawn. It was not long in coming. The moonlight became mixed with the faint rays of the aurora, and objects were seen more distinctly. As the milky quartz caught the hues of morning, we rode out of our cover and forward over the plain. I was apparently tied upon my horse, and guarded between 2 of the Delawares. On approaching the town, we saw several men upon the roofs. They ran to and fro, summoning others out, and large groups began to appear along the terraces. As we came nearer, we were greeted with shouts of congratulation. Avoiding the streets, we pushed directly for the temple at a brisk trot. On arriving at its base, we suddenly halted, flung ourselves from our horses, and climbed the ladders. There were many women upon the parapets of the building. Among these Seguin recognized his daughter, the queen. She was at once secured and forced into the inside. The next moment I held my betrothed in my arms, while her mother was by our side. The other captives were there, and, without waiting to offer any explanation, we hurried them all within the rooms and guarded the doors with our pistols. The whole maneuver had not occupied 2 minutes, but before its completion a wild cry announced that the ruse was detected. Vengeful yells rang over the town, and the warriors, leaping down from their houses, ran towards the temple. Arrows began to hurtle around us, but above all other sounds pealed the notes of the bugle, summoning our comrades to the attack. Quick upon the signal, they were seen debouching from the woods and coming down at a gallop. When within 200 yards of the houses, the charging horsemen divided into 2 columns and wheeled around the town with the intention of attacking it on both sides. The Indians hastened to defend the skirts of the village, but in spite of their arrow flights, which dismounted several, the horsemen closed in, and, flinging themselves from their horses, fought hand to hand among the walls. The shouts of defiance, the sharp ringing of rifles, and the louder reports of the escopettes, soon announced that the battle had fairly begun. A large party, headed by El Sol and Saint Vrain, had ridden up to the temple. Seeing that we had secured the captives, these too dismounted and commenced an attack upon that part of the town, clambering up to the houses and driving out the braves who defended them. The fight now became general. Shouts and sounds of shots rent the air. Men were seen upon high roofs, face to face in deadly and desperate conflict. Crowds of women, screaming and terrified, rushed along the terraces, or ran out upon the plain, making for the woods. Frightened horses, snorting and neighing, galloped through the streets and off over the open prairie, with trailing bridles; while others, enclosed in corrals, plunged and broke over the walls. It was a wild scene, a terrific picture. Through all, I was only a spectator. I was guarding a door of the temple in which were our own friends. My elevated position gave me a view of the whole village, and I could trace the progress of the battle from house to house. I saw that many were falling on both sides, for the savages fought with the courage of despair. I had no fears for the result. The whites, too, had wrongs to redress, and by the remembrance of these were equally nerved for the struggle. In this kind of encounter they had the advantage in arms. It was only on the plains that their savage foes were feared, when charging with their long and death-dealing lances. As I continued to gaze over the azoteas, a terrific scene riveted my attention, and I forgot all others. Upon a high roof 2 men were engaged in combat fierce and deadly. Their brilliant dresses had attracted me, and I soon recognized the combatants. They were Dacoma and the Maricopa. The Navajo fought with a spear, and I saw that the other held his rifle clubbed and empty. When my eye first rested upon them, the latter had just parried a thrust, and was aiming a blow at his antagonist. It fell without effect, and Dacoma, turning quickly, brought his lance again to the charge. Before El Sol could ward it off, the thrust was given, and the weapon appeared to pass through his body. I involuntarily uttered a cry, as I expected to see the noble Indian fall. What was my astonishment at seeing him brandish his tomahawk over his head, and with a crashing blow stretch the Navajo at his feet. Drawn down by the impaling shaft, he fell over the body, but in a moment struggled up again, drew the long lance from his flesh, and tottering forward to the parapet, shouted out, "Here, Luna! Our mother is avenged!" I saw the girl spring upon the roof, followed by Garry, and the next moment the wounded man sank fainting in the arms of the trapper. Rube, Saint Vrain, and several others now climbed to the roof, and commenced examining the wound. I watched them with feelings of painful suspense, for the character of this most singular man had inspired me with friendship. Presently Saint Vrain joined me, and I was assured that the wound was not mortal. The Maricopa would live. The battle was now ended. The warriors who survived had fled to the forest. Shots were heard only at intervals, an occasional shout, the shriek of some savage discovered lurking among the walls. Many white captives had been found in the town, and were brought in front of the temple, guarded by the Mexicans. The Indian women had escaped to the woods during the engagement. It was well, for the hunters and volunteer soldiery, exasperated by wounds and heated by the conflict, now raged around like furies. Smoke ascended from many of the houses, flames followed, and the greater part of the town was soon reduced to a smoldering ruin. We stayed all that day by the Navajo village to recruit our animals and prepare for our homeward journey across the desert. The plundered cattle were collected. Some were slaughtered for immediate use, and the rest placed in charge of vaqueros, to be driven on the hoof. Most of the Indian horses were lassoed and brought in, some to be ridden by the rescued captives, others as the booty of the conquerors. But it was not safe to remain long in the valley. There were other tribes of the Navajos to the north, who would soon be down upon us. There were their allies, the great nations of the Apaches to the south, and the Nijoras to the west; and we knew that all these would unite and follow on our trail. The object of the expedition was attained, at least as far as its leader had designed it. A great number of captives were recovered, whose friends had long since mourned them as lost forever. It would be some time before they would renew those savage forays in which they had annually desolated the pueblos of the frontier. By sunrise of the next day we had repassed the cañon, and were riding towards the snowy mountain. Chapter 56.
of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. El Paso del Norte. I will not describe the recrossing of the desert plains, nor will I detail the incidents of our homeward journey. With all its hardships and weariness, to me it was a pleasant one. It is a pleasure to attend upon her we love, and that along the route was my chief duty. The smiles I received far more than repaid me for the labor I underwent in its discharge. But it was not labor. It was no labor to fill her xuages with fresh water at every spring or runlet, to spread the blanket softly over her saddle, or to weave her a quitasol out of the broad leaves of the palmilla, to assist her in mounting and dismounting. No, that was not labor to me. We were happy as we journeyed. I was happy, for I knew that I had fulfilled my contract and won my bride, and the very remembrance of the perils through which we had so lately passed heightened the happiness of both. But one thing cast an occasional gloom over our thoughts: the Queen, Adele. She was returning to the home of her childhood, not voluntarily, but as a captive to her own kindred, her father and mother. Throughout the journey both these waited upon her with tender assiduity, almost constantly gazing at her with sad and silent looks. There was woe in their hearts. We were not pursued, or if so, our pursuers never came up. Perhaps we were not followed at all. The foe had been crippled and cowed by the terrible chastisement, and we knew it would be some time before they would muster force enough to take our trail. Still we lost not a moment, but traveled as fast as the ganados could be pushed forward. In 5 days we reached the Barranca del Oro, and passed the old mine, the scene of our bloody conflict. During our halt among the ruined ranches I stayed away from the rest, impelled by a painful curiosity to see if aught remained of my late follower or his fellow victim. I went to the spot where I had last seen their bodies. Yes, 2 skeletons lay in front of the shaft, as cleanly picked by the wolves as if they had been dressed for the studio of an anatomist. It was all that remained of the unfortunate men. After leaving the Barranca del Oro, we struck the head waters of the Rio Mimbres, and keeping on the banks of that stream, followed it down to the Del Norte. Next day we entered the pueblo of El Paso. A scene of singular interest greeted us on our arrival. As we neared the town, the whole population flocked out to meet us. Some had come forth from curiosity, some to welcome us and take part in the ceremony that hailed our triumphant return, but not a few impelled by far different motives. We had brought with us a large number of rescued captives, nearly 50 in all, and these were soon surrounded by a crowd of citizens. In that crowd were yearning mothers and fond sisters, lovers newly awakened from despair, and husbands who had not yet ceased to mourn. There were hurried inquiries and quick glances that betokened keen anxiety. There were scenes and shouts of joy as each one recognized some long-lost object of a dear affection. But there were other scenes of diverse character, scenes of woe and wailing. For many of those who had gone forth but a few days before, in the pride of health and the panoply of war, Many came not back. I was particularly struck with one episode, a painful one to witness. 2 women of the poblana class had laid hold upon one of the captives, a girl of, I should think, about 10 years of age. Each claimed the girl for her daughter, and each of them held one of her arms, not rudely, but to hinder the other from carrying her off. A crowd had encircled them, and both the women were urging their claims in loud and plaintive voices. One stated the age of the girl, hastily narrated the history of her capture by the savages, and pointed to certain marks upon her person, to which she declared she was ready at any moment to make juramento. The other appealed to the spectators to look at the color of the child's hair and eyes, which slightly differed from that of the other claimant, and called upon them to note the resemblance she bore to another who stood by, and who, she alleged, was the child's eldest sister. Both talked at the same time, and kissed the girl repeatedly as they talked. The little wild captive stood between the two, receiving their alternate embraces with a wondering and puzzled expression. She was, in truth, a most interesting child, habited in the Indian costume, and browned by the sun of the desert. Whichever might have been the mother, it was evident she had no remembrance of either of them, for here there was no mother. In her infancy she had been carried off to the desert, and, like the daughter of Seguin, had forgotten the scenes of her childhood. She had forgotten father, mother, all. It was, as I have said, a scene painful to witness. The women's looks of anguish, their passionate appeals, their wild but affectionate embraces lavished upon the girl, their plaintive cries mingled with sobs and weeping. It was indeed a painful scene. It was soon brought to a close, at least as far as I witnessed it. The alcalde came upon the ground, and the girl was given in charge to the policia, until the true mother should bring forward more definite proof of maternity. I never heard the finale of this little romance. The return of the expedition to El Paso was celebrated by a triumphant ovation. Cannon boomed, bells rang, fireworks hissed and sputtered, masses were sung, and music filled the streets. Feasting and merriment followed, and the night was turned into a blazing illumination of wax candles and un gran función de baile, a fandango. The next morning Seguin and his wife and daughters made preparations to journey on to the old hacienda on the Del Norte. The house was still standing, so we had heard, but it had not been plundered. The savages, on taking possession of it, had been closely pressed by a body of paseños, and had hurried off with their captives, leaving everything else as they had found it. Saint Vrain and I were to accompany the party to their home. The chief had plans for the future, in which both I and my friend were interested. There we were to mature them. I found the returns of my trading speculation even greater than Saint Vrain had promised. My $10,000 had been trebled. Saint Vrain, too, was master of a large amount, and we were enabled to bestow our bounty on those, our late comrades, who had proved themselves worthy. But most of them had received bounty from another source. As we rode out from El Paso, I chanced to look back. There was a long string of dark objects waving over the gates. There was no mistaking what they were, for they were unlike anything else. They were scalps. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of the Scalp Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne REID. Touching the Chords of Memory. It is the second evening after our arrival at the old house on the Del Norte. We have gone up to the azotea, Seguin, Saint Vrain, and myself. I know not why, but guided thither by our host. Perhaps he wishes to look once more over that wild land, the theatre of so many scenes in his eventful life. Once more, for upon the morrow he leaves it for ever. Our plans have been formed. We journey upon the morrow. We are going over the broad plains to the waters of the Mississippi. They go with us. It is a lovely evening, and warm. The atmosphere is elastic. Such an atmosphere as you can find only on the high tables of the Western world. It seems to act upon all animated nature, judging from its voices. There is joy in the songs of the birds, in the humming of the homeward bees. There is a softness, too, in those sounds that reach us from the farther forest. Those sounds usually harsh, the voices of the wilder and fiercer creatures of the wilderness, all seem attuned to peace and love. The song of the arriero is joyous, for many of these are below, packing for our departure. I, too, am joyous. I have been so for days. But the light atmosphere around and the bright prospect before me have heightened the pulsations of my happiness. Not so my companions of the azotea. Both seem sad. Seguin is silent. I thought he had climbed up here to take a last look of the fair valley. Not so. He paces backward and forward with folded arms, his eyes fixed upon the cemented roof. They see no farther. They see not at all. The eye of his mind only is active, and that is looking inward. His air is abstracted, his brow is clouded, his thoughts are gloomy and painful. I know the cause of all this. She is still a stranger. But Saint Vrain, the witty, the buoyant, the sparkling Saint Vrain, what misfortune has befallen him? What cloud is crossing the rose-colored field of his horoscope? What reptile is gnawing at his heart, that not even the sparkling wine of El Paso can drown? Saint Vrain is speechless. Saint Vrain is sighing. Saint Vrain is sad. I half divine the cause. Saint Vrain is... The tread of light feet upon the stone stairway, the rustling of female dresses. They are ascending. They are Madame Seguin, Adele, Zoe. I look at the mother, at her features. They, too, are shaded by a melancholy expression. Why is she not happy? Why not joyous, having recovered her long-lost, much-loved child? Ah, she has not yet recovered her. I turn my eyes on the daughter, the elder one, the queen. That is the strangest expression of all. Have you seen the captive ocelot? Have you seen the wild bird that refuses to be tamed, but against the bars of its cage prison still beats its bleeding wings? If so, it may help you to fancy that expression. I cannot depict it. She is no longer in the Indian costume. That has been put aside. She wears the dress of civilized life, but she wears it reluctantly. She has shown this, for the skirt is torn in several places, and the bodice, plucked open, displays her bosom half nude, heaving under the wild thoughts which agitate it. She accompanies them, but not us a companion. She has the air of a prisoner, the air of the eagle whose wings have been clipped. She regards neither mother nor sister. Their constant kindness has failed to impress her. The mother has led her to the azotea, and let go her hand. She walks no longer with them, but crouching and in starts from place to place, obedient to the impulse of strong emotions. She has reached the western wing of the azotea, and stands close up against the parapet, gazing upon the Mimbres. She knows them well, those peaks of sparkling selenite, those watch-towers of the desert land. She knows them well. Her heart is with her eyes. We stand watching her, all of us. She is the object of common solicitude. She it is who keeps between all hearts and the light. The father looks sadly on. The mother looks sadly on. Zoe looks sadly on. Saint Vrain, too. No, that is a different expression. His gaze is the gaze of... She has turned suddenly. She perceives that we are all regarding her with attention. Her eyes wander from one to the other. They are fixed upon the glance of Saint Vrain. A change comes over her countenance, a sudden change from dark to bright, like the cloud passing from the sun. Her eye is fired by a new expression. I know it well. I have seen it before, not in her eyes, but in those that resemble them, the eyes of her sister. I know it well. It is the light of love. Saint Vrain, his too are lit by a similar emotion. Happy Saint Vrain, happy that it is mutual. As yet he knows not that, but I do. I could bless him with a single word. Moments pass. Their eyes mingle in fiery communion. They gaze into each other. Neither can avert their glance. A God rules them, the God of love. The proud and energetic attitude of the girl gradually forsakes her. Her features relax. Her eye swims with a softer expression, and her whole bearing seems to have undergone a change. She sinks down upon a bench. She leans against the parapet. She no longer turns to the west. She no longer gazes upon the Mimbres. Her heart is no longer in the desert land. No, it is with her eyes, and these rest almost continuously on Saint Vrain. They wander at intervals over the stones of the azotea. Then her thoughts do not go with them, but they ever return to the same object, to gaze upon it tenderly, more tenderly at each new glance. The anguish of captivity is over. She no longer desires to escape. There is no prison where he dwells. It is now a paradise. Henceforth the doors may be thrown freely open. That little bird will make no further effort to fly from its cage. It is tamed. What memory, friendship, entreaties had failed to effect, love had accomplished in a single instant. Love, mysterious power, in one pulsation had transformed that wild heart, had drawn it from the desert. I fancied that Seguin had noticed all this, for he was observing her movements with attention. I fancied that such thoughts were passing in his mind, and that they were not unpleasing to him, for he looked less afflicted than before. But I did not continue to watch the scene. A deeper interest summoned me aside, and, obedient to the sweet impulse, I strayed towards the southern angle of the azotea. I was not alone. My betrothed was by my side, and our hands, like our hearts, were locked in each other. There was no secrecy about our love. With Zoe there never had been. Nature had prompted the passion. She knew not the conventionalities of the world, of society, of circles refined, soi distant. She knew not that love was a passion for one to be ashamed of. Hitherto no presence had restrained her in its expression, not even that, to lovers of less pure design, awe-inspiring above all others, the presence of the parrots. Alone or in their company there was no difference in her conduct. She knew not the hypocrisies of artificial natures, the restraints, the intrigues, the agonies of atoms that act. She knew not the terror of guilty minds. She obeyed only the impulse her Creator had kindled within her. With me it was otherwise. I had shouldered society, though not much then, enough to make me less proud of love's purity, enough to render me slightly sceptical of its sincerity. But through her I had now escaped from that scepticism. I had become a faithful believer in the nobility of the passion. Our love was sanctioned by those who alone possessed the right to sanction it. It was sanctified by its own purity. We are gazing upon a fair scene, fairer now at the sunset hour. The sun is no longer upon the stream, but its rays slant through the foliage of the cottonwood trees that fringe it, and here and there a yellow beam is flung transversely on the water. The forest is dappled by the high tints of autumn. There are green leaves and red ones, some of a golden color and others of dark maroon. Under this bright mosaic the river winds away like a giant serpent, hiding its head in the darker woods around El Paso. We command a view of all this, for we are above the landscape. We see the brown houses of the village with the shining vane of its church. Our eyes have often rested upon that vane in happy hours, but none happier than now, for our hearts are full of happiness. We talk of the past as well as the present, For Zoe has now seen something of life, its darker pictures, it is true, but these are often the most pleasant to be remembered. And her desert experience has furnished her with many a new thought, the cue to many an inquiry. The future becomes the subject of our converse. It is all bright, though a long and even perilous journey is before us. We think not of that. We look beyond it to that promised hour when I am to teach and she is to learn what is to marry. Someone is touching the strings of the bandolin. We look around. Madame Seguin is seated upon a bench, holding the instrument in her hands. She is tuning it. As yet she has not played. There has been no music since our return. It is by Seguin's request that the instrument has been brought up, with the music, to chase away heavy memories, or perhaps from a hope that it may soothe less savage ones, still dwelling in the bosom of his child. Madame Seguin is about to play, and my companion and I go nearer to listen. Seguin and Saint Vrain are conversing apart. Adele is still seated where we left her, silent and abstracted. The music commences. It is a merry air, a fandango, one of those to which the Andalusian foot delights to keep time. Seguin and Saint Vrain have turned. We all stand looking at the face of Adele. We endeavour to read its expression. The first notes have startled her from her attitude of abstraction. Her eyes wander from one to the other, from the instrument to the player, with looks of wonder, of inquiry. The music continues. The girl has risen, and as it mechanically approaches the bench where her mother is seated, she crouches down by the feet of the latter, places her ear close up to the instrument, and listens attentively. There is a singular expression upon her face. I look at Seguin. That upon his is not less singular. His eye is fixed upon the girl's, gazing with intensity. His lips are apart, yet he seems not to breathe. His arms hang neglected, and he is leaning forward as if to read the thoughts that are passing within her. He starts erect again, as though under the impulse of some sudden resolution. "Ah, Adele, Adele," he cries, hurriedly addressing his wife. "Oh, sing that song, that sweet hymn. You remember. You used to sing it to her, often, often. You remember it, Adele? Look at her. Quick, quick, oh God, perhaps she may—" He is interrupted by the music. The mother has caught his meaning, and with the adroitness of a practised player suddenly changes the tune to one of a far different character. I recognize the beautiful Spanish hymn, La Madre y su hija, the mother to her child. She sings it, accompanying her voice with the bandolin. She throws all her energy into the song until the strain seems inspired. She gives the words with full and passionate effect. Tu duermes, cara niña, tu duermes en la paz. Los ángeles del cielo, los ángeles guardan, guardan. Niña mía, cara mí. The song was interrupted by a cry of singular import, uttered by the girl. The first words of the hymn had caused her to start, and then to listen, if possible, more attentive than ever. As the song proceeded, the singular expression we had noted seemed to become every moment more marked and intense. When the voice had reached the burden of the melody, a strange exclamation escaped her lips, and springing to her feet, she stood gazing wildly in the face of the singer. Only for a moment. The next moment she cried in loud, passionate accents, "Mamma! Mamma!" and fell forward upon the bosom of her mother. Seguin spoke truly when he said, "Perhaps in God's mercy she may yet remember." She had remembered. Not only her mother, but in a short time she remembered him. The chords of memory had been touched, its gates thrown open. She remembered the history of her childhood. She remembered all. I will not essay to describe the scene that followed. I will not attempt to picture the expression of the actors, to speak of their joyous exclamations mingled with sobs and tears. But they were tears of joy. All of us were happy, happy to exultation. But for Seguin himself, I knew it was the hour of his life. End of chapter 57. End of The Scalp Hunters by Thomas Mayne Reid.